But yeah, so thanks everybody for coming again. Just briefly, this is our monthly local groups workshop, local groups and supporters workshop. This month's theme being tax justice. Just to introduce myself again, I'm Jimmy. I'm an organizer with the college based in London, and Therese works with me also at Tech. So yeah, let's just get underway. So our first speaker, Sara from Tax Justice UK, who will talk to us about why we need tax justice and how we might get there. And yeah, with that, I'll pass on to Sara to introduce herself and explain more about her work.
Great, thank you so much, Jimmy and Therese, for having me. And yeah, very nice to meet you all. So I just want to briefly talk to you, about how important a fair and effective tax system that works for everyone is, and yeah, how we might get there, and also what actions you can take at the local level. So first things first, you all know this, being closely associated with the Equality Trust, but it's absolutely unacceptable to see the current levels of poverty and deprivation in the UK. And we know with the cost of living scandal underway, it will get worse in the autumn and winter. And tackling this will really require government investment. You will not be able to tax yourself out of, the hole we're in, but government investment is crucial, but we need to create a tax system that supports these efforts. And I know that sometimes it looks like, oh my God, this is all such a challenge and it's so hopeless, but I just want to really start with giving you a lot of courage and encouragement that we can do this. At Tax Justice UK, we've been working with our partners on various issues of tax justice, and we've achieved 3 government U-turns in 12 months. The first one was last May, when the government didn't really want to support a global corporate minimum tax rate, and they were hosting the G7, and we ran a campaign, and then suddenly it was, the main agenda item on the G7 finance ministers meeting in London. We also campaigned together with partners from Transparency International and many others for the introduction of an economic crime bill. Again, the government tried to drop it quietly earlier this year, but we really campaigned and kicked a big fuss, and it was then subsequently they promised to introduce it, and they did. And most recently, we've seen a win on a windfall tax on oil and gas companies. So if we campaign together, we can really win. So one of the things I think which needs to happen for a fairer tax system is we need to tax wealth more. So those with substantial wealth and profitable companies need to pay their fair share in tax. At the moment, we have a tax system which is very much focused on consumer spending, VAT, and income from work. And we really there is more which needs to be done, much more, to make that more level. What we're talking about what do we mean when we talk about tax wealth more? There are a couple of policy areas which need urgent reform. So one is reforming capital gains tax. So income from wealth is taxed at the same rate as income from work. It currently isn't. And that would bring in, for example, an estimated £14 billion a year. We're also calling for an annual wealth tax, together with the Patriotic Millionaires UK, which is a group of millionaires who want to pay more tax. And they suggested that if those who own over $5 million would pay an annual wealth tax, that this could raise over £43 billion a year. There's also been a wealth tax commission which recommended to potentially look at a one-off wealth tax, which they estimated would bring in £260 billion as a one-off. So there's huge potential to level the playing field and also raise more funds. We've done a lot of work, polling, and also focus group work. And here is one quote from a focus group we ran nearly 2 years ago, but this hasn't changed. And I think this is a sentiment which is echoed across the UK. Why should someone who is working hard to stay on the breadline, why should they pay more tax than someone who makes all that money from shares? Why? Indeed, it makes no sense at all. Here's our polling. Again, it's from nearly 2 years ago, but this really hasn't changed very much. You can see that, the wealthy should pay more tax, is agreed with by 74% of those we asked. We're also calling for taxing profitable companies. So for example, ending global corporate tax dodging would bring in an estimated £13.5 billion a year. And we're also calling to raise corporation tax to 25%, which the government has promised to do, and hopefully does not U-turn on. That would bring in an estimated £17 billion a year. Again, loads of revenue to be had, and leveling the playing field as well. But yeah, this is a very popular thing, especially around tax avoidance being, morally wrong, even if it's technically legal. Again, a stat from our focus group, 81% agree. And I know the Fair Tax Foundation did some polling recently, and there's, while maybe slightly different percentages, but this is really consistent across the years. This is what the polling finds. I'm coming to the end of my presentation, and I know that Mary from the Fair Tax Foundation will tell us more, but in order to get there, to tackle corporate tax dodging, it's not only important to call people out, but also to recognize good corporate tax conduct. So for example, businesses can get accredited to the fair tax mark, and Mary will tell us more. So there's just a lot we can do, both with calling people who maybe not paying their fair share out, but also really, really encouraging the many, many companies and people who really want to pay their tax, or even want to pay more tax to support our public services and everything else we, need tax for. So that's it from me. You can stay in touch with me, and I'll be also in the breakout rooms and answer questions later. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Our next speaker, Mary from the Fair Tax Foundation. She'll introduce herself and the councils for a fairer tax campaign and how you can get involved with that. So yeah, let me pass on to Mary.
Thanks very much, Jimmy. It's really lovely to be here with you all this evening, particularly as this week is our annual Fair Tax Week, where we join together with lots of other tax justice groups in the UK to shine a light on and celebrate organisations, councils that are just proud to pay their fair share of tax, and really celebrate all the great things that it helps to pay for as well. And I know that so many of you through the Equality Trust groups have done such great work around social justice. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say and what you think about this campaign that we're going to talk about this evening. So just really quickly about us and where we fit in with the whole kind of tax justice field. So Fair Tax Foundation is a social enterprise, and what we focus on is what does kind of good look like. So we've seen it, campaigners like Tax Justice UK do a really amazing job of kind of singling out the bad practice, what needs to change, and what we focus on is good practice, both in terms of our fair tax mark for businesses, which we're now delighted to be able to offer to international businesses. Up to last year, it was just UK. Our councils for fair tax declaration, and also Fair Tax Week taking place this week. Tax abuse is still a really, really big issue, and but we've also got to recognise, I think, how far we've come. So Sara just talked now about some of the fantastic campaign wins that we've had. The UK started to clamp down on tax dodging, including via overseas territories, but unfortunately there are still really vast sums that are lost to corporate tax dodging. So I've put some stats up on the screen. And I don't know if you can see here, but the UK is coded red. And this means that it's one of the countries across the globe that loses more than 20% of corporate tax revenue from multinational profit shifting. And it costs the UK around £17 billion of lost corporation tax revenues each year. So still a really big challenge out there, and something that we need to keep a focus on. On the face of it, fair tax might just come across as paying your fair share, being about the, you know, the kind of the size of a tax contribution that a business would make. But it's actually a really big part of it. Just as important is financial transparency. So that's reporting on really openly on profits, taxes paid, and who owns the business. And this is because financial transparency, things like beneficial ownership, full financial reporting, they're key not just to reducing the risk of tax evasion, but also to fraud as well. And so these transparency aspects are really built into our fair tax mark standards for business and our councils for fair tax declaration as well. And you will have heard a lot of around transparency and anti-fraud measures quite recently, and we've been doing a lot of work with anti-corruption groups on the back of the kind of really explosion of interest that we've seen in the UK as a hub for dirty money and all the Russian money that's been and generally dirty money that's been laundered via the UK. And that's in part because it's really easy to register a company in the UK. It's one of the easiest places and one of the fastest places in the world. It's easier to register a company than it is to get out a library card. And so we've been doing a lot of work around this, and we want to see, and we know the government's working on economic crime measures, things like making sure that there's better checks of who registers companies, but we are starting to see some U-turns on the horizon around proper and, you know, full transparency on financial reporting for smaller businesses. So that's something that we're working on a lot. But on to the good news. We've got over 75 businesses that are accredited to our fair tax mark, the gold standard for tax conduct, and they range from social enterprises through to co-ops, listed companies and small enterprises as well. And we now have 20 local councils that are signed up to our councils for fair tax declaration, with now quite a few more waiting in the wings as a result of a great new campaign that we have just launched with Tax Justice UK. And we know that fair tax is something that the public really supports. Sara spoke earlier about some polling stats. So we've polled the UK public around procurement. And so the stat that we got back from our latest polling is that around 66% that believe that the government and local councils should at least consider how companies pay their taxes alongside the value for money and quality of services when they're awarding contracts to companies. We'd known for some time that councils wanted to, you know, tackle tax dodging amongst suppliers and reward good tax conduct. We'd already launched our fair tax mark for business, and so we went away and we did a bit of we employed a data firm to do some number crunching for us, and they found that between 2014 and 2019, some 17.5% of UK public contracts were awarded to companies that are linked to tax havens, and we think that's kind of much the highest rate in Europe. So we know there's a problem in the UK with public contracting, and we also looked at what councils can do within the rules, so the public procurement rules that govern what public bodies can do with public money when they're spending it and issuing contracts. And the legal opinion that we got back said it's actually really hard to consider either poor tax conduct of suppliers or to reward good tax conduct when undertaking public procurement. So what we did was design the Councils for Fair Tax Declaration to be what councils can do now within the rules, and also for councils to join a call for public procurement rules to be reformed. And our new rules, which have been touted as a really big post-Brexit benefit, our new public procurement rules are going through the House of Lords at the moment, and they're going to be going through the House of Commons, we think, later this year. And again, we're really pushing for better consideration of tax conduct. So councils signing up to the Councils for Fair Tax Declaration, they commit to good tax conduct in their own affairs. That's things like making sure contractors are paying fair share of taxes, demanding greater transparency of suppliers. So going back to the beneficial ownership consideration, asking who owns and controls all supplier businesses. So pushing for transparency in supply chains, knowing who they're doing business with. joining in with Fair Tax Week, any businesses that a council is linked to, either it may part own a business or with suppliers, encouraging those businesses to go for Fair Tax Mark assessment and accreditation, and then joining calls for reform of procurement rules. So I'm really, really excited to announce that just last week, our friends at Tax Justice UK, so Sara and Oscar, have been working really, really hard on a new campaign to encourage more councils to the Fair Tax Declaration. And they've launched a new tool, an Email Your Councillor tool that went live last Thursday. And I know that already we've hit 10,000 or more than 10,000 emails going out to councillors, and we've started to see emails come in this week from councils that we don't already have signed up to the declaration, new councils coming on board as well, which is fantastic. And then just a shout out for a couple of webinars that we're running next week, one around the councils for fair tax for councillors, and another one taking a bit of a deep dive into beneficial ownership and financial reporting, just in case anybody here is interested. Okay, that's all I wanted to share, and I'm just really looking forward to hearing what everybody else has got to say. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Mary. That's great. So I'll now pass on to our final speaker, Martin from Exeter City Council, who will speak about how local campaigners encourage the council there to adopt the Councils for a Fair Tax Declaration, and yeah, why the council wanted to get on board in the first place with it. So yeah, Martin, let me pass on to you.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy, and thank you, Sarah and Mary. They were great presentations to start this event off. Really, really informative. Lots of good facts and figures and things in there. So my contribution is a little bit different. I'm going to kind of just tell you all a little story about where I was just over a year ago and how we've ended up where I am now. So I was a newly elected councillor in May last year, and I was sort of casting around, working out what I wanted to do as my sort of first contribution to sort of the council, and where I could make a difference, not just to the ward that elected me, but citywide as well. And I spent a few weeks doing lots of research, and I was contacted by a local resident from my ward who has been described by other people as a super campaigner. That's a judgment that I think I fully share. She's absolutely amazing. Made me go and have a cup of coffee with her, and just gave this amazing pitch about why Exeter City Council should be signing up to the Councils for Fair Tax Declaration, and what it would mean if we could become one of the, because at that stage I don't think there were quite 20. I think it was in the teens, the number of councils when we signed up to, and try and generate a bit of movement on it and get going. So after being pitched to by Anne Barnes, I sat there and listened and thought, okay, right, this is great. This kind of meshes with my values personally as a Labour and cooperative councillor. It meshes with the values of a Labour-run authority here in Exeter. We've been a fair trade accredited city since 2004. It meshes quite nicely with that. We've always been about equality here in the city. I mean, it's just over 100 years since we moved all our meetings to 5:30 at the earliest start, so that it gives an opportunity for working people to be representatives of the city they live in. Prior to that, it was always during the day, which obviously that restricts massively who can be there. So it kind of meshed with not only our recent values and the values of the administration that was running the city currently, but also, you know, we've been a progressive city for a long time, and this was kind of the next step to take. Over the summer, I lobbied various councillors from my own party and the others who sit in opposition, and realised that actually everybody was on board with this. You know, it was a huge thing. There was lots of national and international stories, and that this was an opportunity for little sleepy Exeter down in the West Country to stand up and say, look, this isn't right. We need to change. You know, as a city council, we're one of the largest employers. We're a big anchor, key institution within the city and the region. And we felt this was an opportunity for us to say, look, we're going to conduct ourselves in this way. If you want to do business with us, continue to do business with us, you need to step up, and you need to make sure that your values align with ours, and that we, you know, it's much better than for the whole city. So in October last year, that the motion came to full council. It was a lively debate, overwhelming support, I think is what the papers and the report said. It wasn't quite unanimous. There were a couple of abstentions from some parties. I'm quite pleased to say that the two abstentions lost their seats in this recent May. So if it came up for debate again, I think it would be unanimously supported rather than overwhelmingly. But you know, it's really something that we're looking to build on now here in Exeter. You know, as you drive into the city, all the city signs have got the Fair Trade logo logo on, and we're a fair trade city. And as those signs come up for replacement, we're hoping to get the fair tax mark sign on there so that people know as they're arriving here, this is what we're all about. These are our values. Please share them. So that's kind of where we are. In November, we wrote to HM Treasury to say this is what we've done as a council. And then didn't hear anything back. Thought, oh, well, it's just on somebody's in tray somewhere and it's left. It's not a priority. And a few weeks ago, we got quite a good response from them. The first line was an apology for how long it had taken. You know, I understand that they've been fairly busy with, you know, furlough and one or two other things that are going on at the moment. So we might not have been quite at the top of the in tray. But it was great to get the response from HM Treasury saying that they support the work that we're doing and that, you know, the Fair Tax Mark and Tax Justice UK are doing. I slightly raised an eyebrow at some of it because, you know, while there have been moves by HM Treasury to make the tax system fairer, I don't think they've gone far enough. I think there's a lot more that they could do in terms of compliance, and it certainly wouldn't be a tax system that, as a Labour Party, if we were running the country, would be having. But it is what it is. I'm not going to digress and get too political because yeah, we'll leave that for others and other times. But yeah, so it was really good to hear that actually the government do agree that fair tax is important. So that's kind of just my little intro and stories. But the key message from it, really, the moral to this story is take action, lobby people, email your councillors, you know, use the Tax Justice UK tool that has just gone live over the last week. Even in Exeter, where we've been quite pushy about the fact that we've adopted the fair tax mark, we've been receiving emailers. Councillors all across the city have been getting contact, and, you know, we've been able to be in the fortunate position of replying, saying we've already done this, sending links to the webpage where it shows us up there, sending links to the news stories from October when it went out, and saying, look, you know, we're there, we're glad that you're coming on the journey with us. So congratulations, you know, Tax Justice UK and Sarah. It's a great campaigning tool. It's obviously really being used. So anybody who's not used that facility to email their local councillor, please do so after this meeting tonight. Follow it up with them. Just keep pushing them because, you know, generally politicians are only going to do things if they're popular. So you need to make this, you know, come to the top of every local councillor's inbox, and just keep the pressure on. And then next time an event like this takes place, in 12 months time, it won't just be 20, maybe we can look for 50 councils by that stage. So that's the end of my contribution, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, thanks for that story. And yeah, an inside look at how it became enacted in the first place. And thanks again to Sara and Mary. Yeah, so we've had a lot of great things from our speakers, and my colleague Cerise is going to just facilitate a quick Q&A for everyone. So I'll pass on to Cerise.
Thanks, Jimmy. Thank you, Sara, Mary and Martin. That was really useful and really informative. I've been throwing in some links to all of the things you were talking about in the chat so everybody can see. I guess to kick off the Q&A, firstly, I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat, and then we can just go through your questions as they come. Also, if you would like to raise your hand and ask a question, feel free to do that also. We want to hear your voices as much as our own today, so if you would like to do that, that would be great. The first question that we had in the chat was, most of the firms you mentioned, plus local authorities, would be paying their full taxes anyway. Are there some companies who you have actually persuaded to pay full taxes and or ensure their finances are transparent?
Can I comment on that one, Cerise? And that's a great question, Jackie. And I think I'd start just by saying that we recognise that we've got a long way to go. So we've got 75 firms on board, but, you know, we need hundreds and hundreds. If you look at an organisation like the Living Wage or the Fair Trade Foundation, and how they have grown, that's where we want to be. Those are our ambitions, and we've kind of, you know, we've got a plan for how we want to get there. But what I would say is that none of the businesses that get pretty much none that get the Fair Tax Mark of accreditation will just get a rubber stamp based on what they do already. for pretty much all the businesses that we accredit, what happens is we will go through their report and accounts, and they will have to improve the way that they report. So that might be that the way that they disclose taxes, the way that they describe any tax reliefs, and the idea being that anybody who doesn't have a tax background could pick up the report and accounts and understand how much tax is being paid, how much profits are being made, and who owns and controls the business. And we ask for that ownership to be disclosed right down to around 10%. For Companies House, they ask for disclosure up to 25%. So again, there's kind of a real push around transparency. But that said, we recognise that we're not likely to kind of shift the likes of Amazon directly, but via the work of other organisations that are in the tax justice networks. There's been a resolution filed recently to Amazon via investors to get them to adopt much more transparent financial reporting. Now the resolution didn't pass, but it's the first time, and it got more support than was expected. And that resolution was partly filed via Greater Manchester pension schemes. So again, the local authority pension schemes, another example of what you can do locally to kind of really put pressure on global stuff. And some of the stuff that we do can be a bit more subtle, I think, and happen behind the scenes. So for instance, one of our councils decided not to go ahead with a hotel property deal because there were some concerns about a tax haven that was in the ownership structure. Again, that's not something that would necessarily come out in public, but by signing up to the councils for fair tax declaration, we know that some councils are kind of starting to question things that they do. One had a big purchasing contract come up, and they were looking at ways to not go with Amazon, to go with alternative suppliers. And we hope that we're going to be announcing a really big multinational business to come on board to fair tax mark accreditation in the next month. That would really be a bit of an Amazon challenger. So yeah, it's kind of all these little shifts that start to happen behind the scenes, and as a result of businesses, signing up to, and a result of councils coming on board, we can really start to put pressure on government to change legislation. Because we had our conference last week, and one of the speakers, Margaret Hodge, who's a real kind of tax justice and anti-corruption champion, she said, look, government doesn't really listen to campaign groups a lot of the time, but it does listen to business. And if we've got more businesses that we've got out there, and more councils that we've got out there with cross-party support supporting this, it starts to put pressure on. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Mary. That was really useful. I don't know if anyone has anything else to say about that. I think Mary answered it very thoroughly. So I'll move on to the next question, which was: Christian Aid previously ran a similar campaign aimed at councils called Sourced. Are you linked into them and their supporters?
Shall I come in on that one? The short answer is yes, absolutely. So Councils for Fair Tax actually grew out of the Source campaign. So we collaborated with Christian Aid, and there's some really great work going on in the faith sector as well around, we just had Tax Justice Sunday, around the kind of, I suppose, faith call to action for tax justice, and Sourced was around changing. It was a really kind of techie, but it was a great win, making sure that councils were required to consider the tax conduct of their suppliers. That was already a requirement on central government, but the trouble is that requirement was just to consider bad tax conduct. And the rules say that you can only exclude a supplier where there's been kind of proven misconduct. And because we know that most cases are kind of settled outside of court, it means that the exclusion grounds are rarely, if ever, triggered. So the kind of exclusion grounds are much too narrow. So it was off the back of that campaign with Christian Aid that we kind of looked at it and went, this is just not working. Our procurement rules are just not working. It's just nonsensical that councils can't do more to consider tax conduct of suppliers. They ought to be able to say, look, we will give additional points to a business that has a tax policy saying that we won't abuse tax havens, we won't shift our profits overseas. you're actually not allowed to do that. The rules say that you can't specify corporate-wide policy. So yeah, we're really trying to shift that. But yeah, great. It's really great to hear that Christian Aid source campaign mentioned, because yeah, that's where we started.
If I can come in briefly, just to also for a little bit of background, there's been a big shift in the tax justice movement in the UK over the last maybe 10 to 5 years. A lot of the large international development organizations were quite active and had like strands on tax justice, but have taken a step back. And in this gap, small organizations like, you know, ourselves, Tax Justice UK or Fair Tax Foundation, there's also Church Action for Tax Justice and others have stepped in. We're much, much smaller, which can have an advantage in terms of being quite agile and, you know, we can be quite reactive, but also, you know, we have lost a lot of resourcing. A lot of these really large NGOs have. So yeah, so there's been a shift, and that's why, you know, support for us, you know, in any form is so important.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Sara. That was really useful. Again, I'll move on to the next question so that we can stay on track for time. The government is planning a 20% cut in the civil service. This happened previously with when Osborne was Chancellor, and a 20% cut was applied to Revenue and Customs staff in Treasury. This seems singularly foolish. Should we campaign to protect Revenue and Customs from cuts?
I can come in on this if you want me to. Yes, absolutely, totally agree. I haven't got the stats right now, but I can look them up and post them in the stat. There is basically calculations that how much each member of HMRC, each staff member of HMRC brings in who are, you know, who is working in enforcement, how much money they bring in after their salary and associated costs, and it's quite significant. So yes, absolutely, HMRC needs to be properly resourced. Yeah, and we're calling for that, and this is definitely something you should call for as well.
Yeah, and absolutely agree. We would say the same, and alongside that, I mean, they need more resources, and our UK company registration service, Companies House, needs more resources. So there's a lot of tax justice groups, including us, Tax Justice UK, calling for, so the company registration fee, it costs to register a company online £12.50. That's all it costs. So we're saying that needs to just, you know, that needs to go way higher. You know, I think we would say around 100. Some people are calling for £50, and for that money to go to Companies House, and that money to go to pay for checking, verifying company data that's submitted to make sure that people can't get away with registering companies that are called things like chicken thief, and all kinds of things. I mean, I could tell you stories about the kind of stuff that gets through Companies House, and it's just crazy. So yeah, we need more resources for HMRC, and we need more resources for our Companies House. And I bet Martin could come in from a cuts perspective, and what needs to happen for local authorities to be able to support, you know, this stuff through their procurement and finance team.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's devastation really which has gone on over the last decade, and I think that's putting it mildly really in terms of resource for local authorities and the whole of the civil service, means that it's really challenging to get this stuff done, because there is so little capacity left in the system now. I mean, it was one of the biggest pushbacks that we got from officers when, as councillors, we took this fair tax declaration to them and said, how does this impact the activity that we take on here in Exeter? And it you know, that's why I went to them in June, and we didn't take it to council until October, because it took that long to find the officer time for them to do the due diligence to say, actually, actually we are aligned with this and we just need to make a few tweaks here. We're not a council that's set up arm's length management organisations in groups, to try and avoid corporation tax like some authorities have done. So we didn't have to go and sort of rejig a lot of things. But if we did, I probably wouldn't be able to be sat here talking to you now, because there just isn't that sort of officer resource in local government to do the due diligence that would be required. And that's only going to get worse, I fear, because they're talking about civil service cuts of 20% on a national level. I would imagine if you get the data from local government officers, it's probably even more, and that we're still faced with savage cuts from the coalition government that are still to take effect in certain areas that are kind of inbuilt into the system without what's gone on over the last few years. So it's kind of still layer on layer on layer of reduction of resource, which just makes it everything harder. And when it's kind of like it's a non-statutory duty to fair tax, it's an additional thing that councils want to do. And there are some areas in the country where there's just nothing that's not statutory is taking place because there isn't the funding available. If you're left as a politician with a choice of emptying somebody's bins or signing a fair tax declaration and making sure your procurement's done properly, well, which is the bigger doorstep issue? So there needs to be an element of realism about that. So it's really difficult as councils to find the capacity to be able to do this work that they. Well, we need to. The globe needs us to do it. So we've got to take the stands, and hopefully there's more councils will be reprioritising because, it is an opportunity cost. Every time we decide to do one thing, it means that we're not doing something else. And those choices are getting harder and harder in local government.
Thank you, Martin. So we've got a couple more questions which take us over to the Q&A. So I'll just ask the last three. If there are 3 things the average person can do in order to support changes in the taxation system, what might they be?
I can make a start with maybe my 3 highlights. So there is a lot you can do, really, and every action you take is really, really valuable. So obviously, as we are talking, we already talked about, the Council for Fair Tax. So do email your councillor if you haven't done already. And as Martin said, follow up. If you don't get a response or maybe a lukewarm one, meet them. So really just lobby them. Second, I would say we have a petition which is calling for fair tax to help support the cost of living crisis. Maybe Oscar, you can put it in the chat. So please, do sign it. We really, Tax Justice UK, we don't just get people to sign petitions and then we don't do anything with them. We hand them in, we really use them integrated as part of the bigger campaign. So we have over 80,000, I think, signatures already. So please add your voice to that. And thirdly, do email your MP. They are your MPs, they are your elected representatives. We hear in the media a lot around, cutting taxes narratives. This is really, really important for ordinary people to support a fair and effective tax system and really tell their MPs about this, that this is something which is important. It's, pays for public services. It helps support people in this moment of crisis. These are my 3. If I can have a cheeky 4th one, the easiest way you can also sign up to our weekly email to supporters, where we tell people about the latest developments and how they might best take action. So that's my cheeky 4. Sorry, I squeezed in an extra one.
That's fine.
I would really echo what Sara has just said, and go back to earlier about how a lot of the major development, and you've got a team at Tax Justice UK, a small team that are really punching above their weight, and so by that and the emails that they send out are so short, so action orientated, and just a great way to kind of get your head around, take you a couple of minutes to read and really just. So what we do as a kind of tax justice set of groups is Tax Justice UK will really lead on the campaigning angles. So Fair Tax Mark, we in Fair Tax Foundation, we tend to focus on institutional tax conduct. And so what Tax Justice UK have so brilliantly done is pick up our Councils for Fair Tax campaign and really get it out there to supporters. And, are so great at raising the profile and with such a small team. So yeah, I'd really just echo that.
Can I just jump in with one more thing really that you need to do? Not just email your councillors, but it's the most powerful thing any citizen can ever do, and that's vote. And when you put that cross in the box, make sure that the person you're voting for is aligned with fair tax and the values that we're all sharing here tonight. Because if they're not, don't vote for them, vote for somebody else. Because if they're not committed publicly to backing fair tax and regulatory changes that we need to see happen, they're not going to do it once they're in, so you need to make sure that you do your scrutiny first up, ask all the candidates next time there's an election in your area, email them, say, do you support this? I will vote for you if you support this. Be mercenary about it, sell them your vote. It's the most powerful thing you've got. That is the one thing you can really do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. That was really useful. The accreditation market seems to be quite busy, e.g. we've already discussed the fair trade and living wage accreditations in addition to fair tax. What are the risks with this, and what potential is there for collaboration/integration?
Yeah, great question. So I think it's really positive that the accreditation mark is busy, and I think the growth of them shows that there is a real appetite amongst businesses and consumers for not just kind of an independent badge that is trusted. I guess the risks are that you might get schemes that are watered down, not meaningful, kind of greenwashing style things, or the equivalents. Or you might kind of get, a worry about accreditation fatigue, but we are not seeing that. Our public polling really shows that people want these trusted and independent accreditations. I think on collaboration and integration, I think it's really important that each one has its specialist area. The amount of work that goes into tax and just understanding tax and what good looks like, it takes a real specialist team to be able to do that. And I think you have the same with living wage and fair trade. And what we do is we learn from each other, and we learn about how we grow and how you get bigger. And then we may collaborate on things like, industry-wide schemes that pull together a lot of these different things like perhaps the business and communities approach, their Good Business Awards, and so they will pull together elements of all the different accreditation schemes into one. But I think it's important to also have those specialist areas as well.
Thank you, Mary. Does anyone want to touch on that point? No? Okay. The last question did seem really good, so I'm going to ask it. A couple of months ago, it didn't seem politically likely that a windfall tax, for example, was going to be introduced. Yet the situation became so dire for so many that the government was forced to act. Even if it was too little, what do you think is the most we can win/push for in the current climate?
I can maybe just come in, and also I just want to say the windfall tax, I think it didn't just happen. The government was very, very clear they weren't going to do it. And I don't think they just happened to change their mind because they saw people getting poorer. I think this was a really concerted cross-sector effort to campaign for windfall tax. We put together a campaign group across tax justice, climate justice, and fuel poverty to really push for it. And obviously the opposition parties had been pushing for it as well. But, just to say, this doesn't just unfortunately magically happen. I wish it would. We could put our feet up. But, it is this coming together with across the board, which really, really makes us powerful and gets the government to change its mind. What is the most we could win for? See, this is the thing. When we convened about the windfall tax, almost all the other NGOs told me, oh, Sara, windfall tax is not going to happen before the budget and probably not even then. So I think I would say the possibilities are possibly bigger than we think. I would definitely say there is a lot more in my presentation, as I said, on taxing wealth more. We're such an unequal society. Patriotic millionaires themselves say, it wouldn't hurt us if you tax us more. We're still going to be rich. So I think there's definitely a lot more to be won on taxing wealth more. And as I said in my presentation, there are various policies you could use to achieve that. But that's definitely much more scope in an unequal society, in such an unequal society as the UK is, and with such really, high levels of poverty and deprivation, which are only set to rise with the cost of living.
Thank you.
I think we can be really ambitious at the moment. I think we're into the, anything's possible, but things are starting to be probable that were never even thought of as possible a few months or years ago now. I think complete regulatory change could be on the cards now, because the government have got a tax burden which is the highest it's been for more than 70 years. There's nothing left in our pockets, the pockets of workers, to be picked by the government. So something has to change dramatically. We need to raise more revenue. The only option really is going to be, as Sarah says, some sort of wealth tax. What that looks like, that's really what's to play for now. So we can be ambitious, we can be bold and creative, and really go for anything, because it's got to be something dramatic, or we're just not going to be able to fund the public services that we're going to need as we move into this sort of post-pandemic world. So just anything is possible now, and I think it's a really exciting time. So just, if you have an idea, no matter how crazy it is, pitch it, campaign for it, push for it. Anything could happen now.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you to our amazing speakers for great presentations and talks, and also a fantastic Q&A session. And thank you so much. We will be sending out the video recording, and also any of the slides and some more links from our guest speakers if you want to find out more. But thank you so much everyone for taking part, and we hope to see you again soon.